I've always believed the first night out is the worst. I'd planned this trip to Sleeping Giant Provincial Park in Ontario for months, ever since I got back from a chaotic stint at work that left me burnt out and twitchy. All I wanted was some time alone. No people, no traffic, no phones buzzing, no endless meetings. Just the silence of the woods, the pull of my backpack across my shoulders, the ache in my legs from a hard climb, and the sound of the lake brushing up against the shore. I picked late summer, early September, for this solo hike because the bugs weren't as bad, and the park would be a little quieter. Kids were back in school, families thinning out, campsites easier to book. My route was planned out over a few days, mostly along the Cabian Trail, with side trips where it made sense. I'd pitch my tent close to the water when I could, near the edges of the forest but not deep in, just the way I like it. First night was set up on the southern tip of the peninsula, where the trail bends and you can get down to a rocky beach. The spot I chose was about 50 feet above the lake, just off the trail, with a view down a gentle slope to a wide strip of pebbled shoreline. Behind me were dense spruces and poplars, thick underbrush, and some exposed rock. The trees creaked and sighed with the wind, and beyond them, the woods stretched deep and dark. I'd bushwhacked a bit off the path to find the flattest piece of ground for my tent, and it sat in this pocket where I could hear the lake but not see much of it unless I stood up. It was a pretty spot, really quiet too. During the day, I remember the sun dipping low, throwing this orange wash across the treetops, and everything seemed calm. I cooked a quick meal on my little stove, tucked my food in a bag and hung it in a tree downwind, and got ready to call it a night. Everything was neat and orderly. Boots just outside the vestibule, pack inside the tent, sleeping bag already fluffed up, water bottle beside me. I'd done this 100 times. Solo hiking wasn't new to me, but even with all that experience, the first night alone in the woods always feels off. It's not just the noise, it's the way the dark settles in. In a city, darkness has layers, streetlights, car headlights, porch lights, windows. Out here, it's like someone turns the dial to 0. 1 minute, there's color, movement, life. The next, it's like the forest just swallows everything. Sound changes too. It stops being background and starts being something else. Every crack, every flutter, every snap of a branch feels close. Lying in my sleeping bag, I kept telling myself it was normal. The wind, the squirrels, the trees rubbing against each other, animals foraging. All of it was part of the woods doing what the woods do. But that didn't make it easier. My heart kept jumping every time something shifted outside. I'd hear a rustle and immediately think, person. Not bear, not raccoon, person. Some weirdo wandering the woods in the middle of the night. A man with no light, no gear, just a knife and a reason. That was the picture my brain painted. Couldn't help it. It's always the same the first night out. I lay there stiff, eyes open in the dark, just listening. There was a branch that snapped around 11 p.m. or so. At least, I think it was that late. I wasn't wearing a watch, and I kept my phone turned off to conserve battery. I only brought it for GPS and emergencies. But this sound, this sharp crack, it was close. Not like falling from a tree, but like pressure, like weight, something stepping on something it shouldn't. My breathing got shallow. My back was slick with sweat even though the air was cool. I didn't move, just stared up at the roof of the tent and listened harder. I heard another crunch, like twigs or dry leaves, and something shifting, like a brush of fur against bark or a heavy footfall just outside my sight line. Could have been a deer or even a bear, I knew that. But the brain doesn't care about what's logical when it's scared. It builds stories, flashes through headlines. Missing solo hiker found weeks later. Camper never returned. Unidentified footprints. You read enough backcountry horror stories and even the most harmless noise starts to carry weight. I kept trying to slow my breathing, remind myself that I'd prepped. I had bear spray. I had my knife. I'd strung up my food properly, and I hadn't seen any fresh scat or prints nearby. I was fine, but I didn't feel fine. Something moved again. Not fast, not crashing through the woods, deliberate. The weight of it sounded different from a raccoon or porcupine. Heavier. My heart was hammering. I was certain this was it. Someone had followed me. I passed a guy on the trail earlier that afternoon who gave me a weird look. Maybe he'd looped around, waited until I set up camp. Maybe he'd watched me from the trees. It wasn't rational, but it was where my mind went. Then I heard it. Crash. Not a huge one, more like a slide, a tumble, followed by a sharp clatter of rock on rock. It sounded like it came from the slope right in front of my tent, the direction of the beach. I froze. That sound wasn't a footstep. It was bigger than that, and it was close. It echoed up from the rocks like something had rolled or fallen hard. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to my own heartbeat. Eventually, I reached out, slow, careful, and grabbed my flashlight from beside my sleeping pad. I waited again, just holding it. Then I clicked it on, bracing myself for whatever might be on the other side of the nylon. I didn't want to unzip the tent, but I knew I had to. I needed to see. I slid the zipper down slowly, my other hand tight on the flashlight, and angled the beam out into the night. And there it was, an elk, or more accurately, a giant, clumsy, very surprised elk splayed halfway down the slope to the beach, its long legs tangled beneath it like some awkward cartoon. It must have slipped on the loose dirt or rocks. One of its back legs was still kicking a little like it couldn't quite get up. It snorted, loud and wet, and scrambled again, hooves scraping against the slope until it finally righted itself and stood. It just stood there for a second, looking as startled as I felt. Its ears twitched, head turning toward me for a moment, catching the light from my flashlight in its eyes. Two dull reflections that blinked, then turned away as it shook itself off and started making its way down toward the beach. I watched it go, slowly, deliberately, no longer stumbling. It stepped over a fallen log, paused near a patch of grass, and then walked along the water's edge until it was out of sight. My whole body let go then. I sat back into the tent and just laughed. Quiet, nervous, but real. All that fear, all that dread, and it was just an elk that couldn't handle a slope. I didn't sleep much after that, but I wasn't as wired. The worst had happened. Something big had come crashing out of the woods, and it hadn't been a serial killer or a bear, just an ungainly elk making a mess of things. I turned the flashlight off after a while, zipped the door back up, and lay on my back listening again. The forest didn't sound so threatening anymore. Still busy, still wild, but less like it was hunting me. More like it was just there, alive, doing what it always did with or without me. The elk must have wandered off down the shoreline, maybe toward one of the meadowy areas near the lowlands. I'd heard they were common in the park, but it was rare to catch one this close up, especially in the dark. I almost felt lucky. I drifted off sometime close to dawn, when the sky was starting to lighten just a little and the birds were waking up. There's this weird in-between time when the dark starts to break and the world feels like it's being exhaled. That's when I finally slept. The next morning, I stepped out and checked the slope. Sure enough, there was a line of kicked-up earth and a few big stones at the bottom that looked out of place. Must have been the ones I'd heard clattering. I saw some wide tracks in the dirt, two clear, fresh impressions of hooves heading down toward the beach. I followed them a little, just far enough to the water's edge, and stood there looking out. The lake was calm, the sun just starting to crest over the trees behind me. A few birds were out, some insects skimming the surface of the water. I didn't see the elk again. It had probably moved on during the night, back into the brush somewhere. I went back up, made coffee, packed up camp slowly, and took a long breath before heading back onto the trail. My legs felt strong, and my nerves had finally settled. It's funny how fear works, how it builds up in your head and makes everything feel like a threat until reality reminds you it's usually not that dramatic. Just a big animal having a bad night on a slope. Still, every step that first morning, I kept glancing behind me, just in case. I was hiking the Great Dividing Range in Australia during the summer. It was one of those long-haul treks where you really start to feel the country under your skin. The dry heat, the gum trees stretching overhead, the dust in your socks, the ache in your shoulders from your pack. We didn't take tents because of the heat. Sleeping under the stars had seemed like a great idea back when we were packing. No extra weight, No messing around with poles or zippers or cramped nylon corners. Just a sleeping bag, a mat, and a tent fly folded in the bottom of the pack in case of rain. Most nights it was perfect. The sky out there is so clear you feel like you can fall into it. Stars that looked like they were close enough to pluck out of the air. There was always a breeze, and the sounds of the bush dry rustling leaves. A few distant calls of birds settling in or waking up gave the whole place a sort of rhythm that helped you drift off. No car engines, no city hum, no glowing lights behind curtains. Just land, open and quiet and real. We'd been out for several nights by the time this happened. We'd hit a section with wide open ridgelines and longer days between water sources. So we'd been pushing ourselves, aiming to cover more distance during the daylight. I was already sore by the time we stopped that night. Knees, hips, the skin on the back of my neck where my shirt collar had rubbed raw. We found a flat clearing with a good view down the slope toward a dry creek bed. It looked safe and far enough off the trail that we wouldn't get any surprise visitors. The ground was hard-packed earth with patches of dried grass. There were scattered gum trees around, but nothing too dense. From the higher ground, we had a little breeze, which helped cut the heat a bit. I dropped my pack, drank the last of my water, and sat on my mat with that deep feeling of relief you only get when you know you don't have to walk any farther that day. It was late evening by the time we were settled, maybe 7:30 or 8. The sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched out, long and dark across the ridge. I got out my sleeping bag and laid it down on the flattest spot I could find, right next to my pack. I usually like to keep everything close at night: pack, boots, headlamp, water bottle, all within reach. I ate a quick meal, just a few crackers, jerky, and a handful of trail mix. Didn't have the energy to cook. I remember the light fading and the air cooling. The last birds called it a day and the wind quieted. Everything turned soft. The silence out there feels like a presence. It's heavy, thick, like the bush is holding its breath. I crawled into my bag and laid back, my head propped slightly by the rolled-up fleece I used as a pillow. The stars came out slowly, first one, then a few more, and then the whole sky was speckled with them. I remember thinking how good it felt to just lie there in the open like that. No roof, no walls. It's rare to feel that kind of space when you sleep, but I didn't sleep well. Something was off. I noticed it pretty early on. There was this occasional brushing sensation against my cheek. At first, I thought it was the breeze moving a blade of dry grass nearby, but then I felt it again and then on my neck. It was light, soft, ticklish, but not painful. I reached up, brushed my face, and my fingers came away with something fuzzy. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but it felt like a little caterpillar. I sat up and turned on my headlamp. That was the first real clue that something was wrong. The light hit the ground around my sleeping bag, and it was moving. Tiny shapes everywhere, all in motion. I leaned closer and saw them clearly. Hairy little caterpillars, a whole mess of them, crawling across the earth like they were on a mission. They weren't huge, maybe the length of my pinky, fat little things with fine bristles all over. They were brownish with a reddish tint under the light. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving together, crawling up over rocks, across leaves, along sleeping bags, boots, food bags, everything. I checked my arms. Couple were already on me. I flicked them off and zipped up my sleeping bag to my chest. That made it worse. Some were already inside. I scrambled out of the bag completely, shaking it hard, trying to knock everything loose. A couple dropped to the ground and crawled off like nothing had happened. I walked in a circle around the camp, headlamp on, looking at the ground. They were everywhere. Just an endless slow-motion wave of fuzzy brown caterpillars spreading out across the campsite. There was no single nest or pile. They seemed to be coming from the bush edge behind us, swarming across the whole clearing. I didn't know what kind they were or whether they could sting, but I didn't really want to find out. I remembered something vague about Australian caterpillars. Some of them can leave irritating hairs that cause rashes or breathing problems. I didn't think these were that bad, but the fact that they were crawling across my face while I slept was enough to ruin any sense of peace I had. The rest of the night was a battle. Couldn't sleep. Every few minutes I'd feel one crawling on me, on my hand, my ear, my neck. Even after I pulled my sleeping bag over my head, they somehow kept getting in. I'd lie there for 20 minutes, then feel something move, and I'd have to sit up again and brush them off. Eventually, I gave up on the sleeping bag altogether and just sat with my knees pulled up, a jacket over my shoulders, the headlamp running low, watching the ground like it was alive. I tried moving spots, dragging my mat to another corner of the clearing, but it made no difference. The caterpillars were everywhere. I tried laying the tent fly over me, but it just trapped the heat and made everything feel sticky. Couldn't win. Every time I laid back down, they found me again. At one point, around 2 or 3 a.m., I walked a short distance down the slope, just to see if maybe lower ground had fewer of them. Didn't. I stood there, looking up at the ridgeline where my pack was, where the others were probably trying to sleep, and felt this weird mix of irritation and awe. I was exhausted, itchy, covered in dirt, and weirdly impressed at the sheer persistence of these tiny, brainless things. By the time the sky started to lighten around 5 a.m., I was half awake, not quite asleep, lying with my back against a fallen log and the hood of my fleece pulled tight over my face. I could still feel the caterpillars crawling across my ankles and up the back of my hands, but I was too tired to do anything about it. I just lay there, staring at the sky, watching it go from black to navy to gray. When the sun finally came up, I got to my feet and walked stiffly back up the slope to where my pack was. My sleeping bag was speckled with dirt and caterpillar droppings. I shook it out the best I could, packed it, and zipped it tight. Everything felt gritty and gross. My arms and neck had little red lines where the hairs had irritated the skin. It wasn't painful, just itchy, like bad mosquito bites. The others looked just as wrecked as I felt. Nobody had slept well. The caterpillars had made their way into everything. We brushed them off our gear, shook out our clothes, and got moving as quickly as we could. That day was rough. I was sleep-deprived, itchy, and slightly paranoid that I still had bugs crawling on me even though I didn't. We hiked in silence for the first couple of hours. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the flies came out fast. It was one of those days where every step feels mechanical, like your body is moving on autopilot but your brain is just floating somewhere behind your eyes. We didn't talk much about the caterpillars. There wasn't much to say. It was just one of those things that happens out there. A long, uncomfortable night that you push through, and then it's done. Looking back on it now, it was miserable. I'm not going to pretend it was a magical wildlife experience or something profound. It was a terrible night full of crawling bugs and constant discomfort. But it was also real, raw, and in some strange way, it stuck with me. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm home and it's quiet, and I feel something brush against my skin in the dark. My first instinct even now is to flick it off and check for bristles. The Great Dividing Range was beautiful, dry and harsh and enormous, full of heat and silence and life you can't always see until it's crawling across your face. That caterpillar night didn't ruin the trip. It was just part of it. One more story buried in the dust of the trail. We moved on the next day and camped elsewhere, away from the infestation. I slept fine the rest of the trip, but I'll never forget that one night under the stars, when I wasn't alone out there. Not by a long shot. I was 23 the first time I spent a night alone in the redwood forests of Northern California. It was early fall. One of those stretches where the days are still warm enough to fool you into thinking summer hasn't ended, but the nights drop just low enough to remind you otherwise. I had no money to my name. My car barely ran, I was between jobs, and I was figuring things out one meal and one tank of gas at a time. It was one of those points in life where every decision feels like it carries the weight of the next 5 years on its back. And at the same time, nothing really matters because you're already used to scraping by. I had made it to the coast a few days earlier, following Highway 101 North, stopping in little towns and sleeping mostly in rest areas or out-of-sight down forest roads. That night, I'd pulled off into the forest, a bit deeper than usual. I remember driving slowly along a narrow dirt road for maybe half a mile until it widened enough at a turnout. The redwoods were huge and quiet. Their bark seemed to swallow sound, and when the wind moved through them, it made more of a deep whoosh than a rustle. It felt like being underwater, like everything was muffled. There were no other cars, no lights, no sounds. I could hear my own breathing once I turned the engine off. I didn't even have a tent. I couldn't afford one. What I did have was a big woven blanket I'd picked up from a roadside market, a decent sleeping bag, and a pile of other old blankets I kept stuffed in the trunk. I spread the big blanket on the forest floor, taking care to smooth it out. The ground was soft with old needles and leaves, and though there were tree roots here and there, I managed to find a fairly flat spot between two massive trunks. I laid out my sleeping bag and layered a couple of other blankets on top of that. It wasn't ideal, but I'd slept in worse places. Once I was zipped up, I pulled the blankets over me, curled onto my side, and stared up at the faint slice of sky visible through the redwood canopy. The forest was dark but not threatening, just quiet, with the occasional hoot of an owl or distant snap of some small animal moving through the brush. It had been a long day of driving, and despite the chill in the air, I fell asleep quickly. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My watch had broken earlier that week. I only stirred because I had that half-awake feeling that something was off. It wasn't a sound or a smell, just a shift in the quiet. I was still bundled up tightly, and I hadn't moved much, so my body heat was trapped. I remember blinking a few times, unsure why I was awake. My flashlight was sitting next to me, one of those older plastic ones that takes D batteries and feels like a small baton. I grabbed it, flicked it on, and the beam punched through the dark. That's when I saw them. All the way around the edge of the blanket, an almost perfect circle, was a solid ring of black spiders. They weren't the kind you find in the corners of your house or skittering across sidewalks. These were long-legged, spindly things, maybe the size of my palm with the legs spread out. They stood still, shoulder to shoulder, if spiders even have shoulders, their legs brushing against each other in a sort of wall, all facing outward. Not one was pointing toward me. They weren't moving, just standing there, silent and alert. My heart jumped a little. For a second, I thought maybe I was still dreaming. I shined the light directly at them, moved it in a slow arc, taking in the whole circle. They didn't flinch. Nothing scurried. Not one of them turned toward the light. I just lay there, propped up on one elbow inside the sleeping bag, watching this perimeter of unmoving spiders. I wasn't panicked. Strangely, I didn't feel afraid. There was no sign that they were interested in me. They looked like they were standing guard, waiting. I thought maybe they were after smaller bugs. Maybe something in the warmth of the blanket had attracted insects, and the spiders had gathered for the feast. It wasn't a comforting idea, but it made sense. I didn't move much after that. Just slowly lowered the flashlight, clicked it off, and pulled the covers tight around myself. My body tensed as I tried to block out the mental image of dozens of spiders standing leg to leg around me. I closed my eyes and lay still, trying not to think about whether one might wander across my face during the night. Eventually, I fell back asleep. When I woke again, it was daylight. Sunlight was filtering through the high canopy, casting golden slashes on the forest floor. There were bird calls now, low chirps and occasional sharp cries. The ground smelled like moss and bark. I sat up slowly, squinting in the light. The spiders were gone. I checked the blanket carefully, then the ground all around it. Nothing. Not a single spider. No webs, no husks, no sign they'd ever been there. I even lifted the blanket's edge to see underneath, half expecting to find a nest or something like that. There was nothing but forest debris. Tiny needles, little bits of rotting leaf, the broken shell of an acorn. I stood, stretched out my back, and took a long look at my surroundings. The redwoods were impossibly tall, their bark rising like pillars into the misty green canopy. I was completely alone. There was a certain stillness that comes after a night in the woods. Everything has a bit of dew on it, even the air. My breath came out in faint clouds as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shook out the blankets, and packed up everything into the trunk. I didn't think much more about the spiders. I was tired, hungry, and I still had 100 miles or so to make that day. I figured it was one of those strange things nature does, like fish swimming in patterns or birds nesting together on a line. Maybe it was some instinctual behavior. Maybe the spiders sensed prey, or warmth, or moisture. I didn't know, and I didn't care to figure it out. I was just glad I hadn't rolled over onto one of them. But that moment stuck with me. I didn't talk about it much, because it didn't sound like anything worth telling unless you were trying to spook someone. It didn't feel spooky at the time, just surreal. Odd in that way that the natural world can sometimes be. Something precise and silent and unexplainable that happens without anyone else around to witness it. Over the years, I've slept in a lot of places, in cars, under overpasses, on rooftops, and in hostels. But no moment has ever felt quite like that one. There was something weirdly organized about those spiders. The fact they faced outward still sticks with me, like they were watching. Not me, but the forest. I've tried to look it up since. I found articles about spiders forming colonies, certain kinds of social spiders that work together, share food, but nothing matched exactly what I saw. No mention of them arranging themselves in a circle, of staying perfectly still through the night like some kind of living fence. I guess nature doesn't always follow the rules we think it does. Sometimes it does something that doesn't show up in a field guide. I haven't been back to that exact spot since. I've returned to the redwoods plenty of times over the years, hiking different trails and camping in more established sites. I've even brought a tent with me once I could afford one. But I've never again laid a blanket directly on the forest floor and fallen asleep with nothing between me and the dirt. It's not that I'm afraid of spiders. I'm really not. It's just that I realized how little control I actually had out there. In that one moment, tucked in a sleeping bag under the stars, I was the most vulnerable I've ever been. And something in the forest noticed. That night didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a reminder that even when it's quiet, even when you think you're alone, there are patterns happening all around you that you can't see. 1,000 tiny lives, each moving according to rules that don't care if you understand them. And sometimes they circle around you, not to hurt you, not even to warn you, just because that's where you are. It was a Sunday when I decided to go out hiking. I remember because it was one of those weekends where I didn't really want to be home. The weather had been good all week, and I'd been spending too much time indoors. So that morning I threw together my small day pack. Just water, some snacks, my folding knife, a first aid kit, and my phone, and drove about an hour out to a trail I hadn't been on in a few years. This place was a bit more remote than the ones closer to town. Less traffic, fewer hikers. It was quiet. The parking lot was barely marked, just a patch of dirt and some tire ruts. I pulled in, saw that I was the only car there, and parked under a pine tree. There was a light breeze blowing. The smell of the trees and dry dirt reminded me of camping trips when I was a kid. The trail started off as a narrow dirt path, winding through scrub and scattered boulders. It was the kind of terrain that slowly climbed upward, not steep enough to feel like a workout at first, but after an hour or so, your legs knew they were working. I didn't mind. I took my time, stopping now and then to drink water or just listen. The farther in I got, the quieter it became. No road sounds, no other people, just the wind in the brush and the dry crunch of my boots. After maybe an hour and a half of hiking, I came to a spot I remembered. There was a large, flat rock outcropping that jutted out over a small valley. It wasn't on the main trail, more of a short side climb, a steep little scramble that didn't look like much from the path. But once you were up there, the view was wide open. You could see for miles, especially on a clear day like that one. I remembered eating lunch there years ago. I climbed up and sat down on the warm surface. My breathing slowed. I pulled out a granola bar and sat with my legs stretched out in front of me, letting the sun soak into my shirt. From where I was sitting, the drop below was steep, probably 20 or 30 feet down, maybe more. Jagged rocks and loose dirt made it dangerous if someone lost their footing. While I was chewing, I heard a soft sound behind me. Not loud, just a light scraping, like something moving slowly over the stone. I turned and saw a cat, a small, dusty-colored stray with patchy fur and thin limbs. It looked like it had been living wild for a long time. Not skinny enough to be starving, but not well-fed either. Its ears were a little torn. One eye seemed cloudy, maybe from an old injury. I was surprised, but not scared. I like animals, and cats especially. I figured maybe it was feral or had wandered from some old rural property nearby. It didn't make a sound, just stood a few feet away from me, staring. I stayed still, not wanting to scare it off. After a few seconds, it stepped closer and sat down. Not right next to me, but close enough to make it clear it wasn't afraid. I watched it for a while, kept looking around, ears twitching, tail flicking slowly across the rock. It didn't beg for food, didn't meow or try to get near my pack. It just sat there. Every now and then it looked behind us, toward the trees. I looked too, but didn't see anything. I figured it was just being a cat. Skittish, alert, but it didn't leave. Even after I finished eating, it stayed put. When I stood up and stretched, it stood too. When I walked to the edge and looked down into the valley, it walked with me and sat again, just behind my heel. I thought maybe it was just curious or lonely. Animals can be odd sometimes. I stayed on the rock for maybe half an hour. It was peaceful, no rush to get anywhere. The air was dry, and the sun had that warm, late afternoon feel. When I finally decided to head back, I stepped off the rock and started down the steep slope. The cat followed, carefully. It moved slow, placing each paw like it was picking a path. I kept expecting it to dart off into the brush, but it didn't. It trailed behind me as I made my way back to the main trail. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe it was just walking the same direction. But after 10 minutes of hiking, it was still there, a few feet behind me, always stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved. I started to feel a little strange about it. Not scared, just unsettled. Like I'd been chosen for something without knowing why. I kept walking, checking behind me more often. The trail narrowed again, passing through thicker brush, and I noticed how the cat kept looking into the trees. Not at me, not at the trail, into the woods, like it was watching something. Then I heard the sound. It was faint, like a stick breaking underfoot, but heavier. Something stepped on dry brush, further back, off the trail. I stopped, so did the cat, crouched a little, not in fear, more like it was ready to spring. I stayed still for maybe a minute, listened. Nothing. No birds, no wind just then. Just the thick, dry quiet of a forest holding its breath. Then, another sound, a deeper rustling like something moving through the undergrowth. I'm not one to panic, but that sound was too deliberate. Not a deer, not a rabbit, bigger. I thought about bears, but this wasn't bear country, and the pattern of the sound wasn't right. It wasn't crashing through, just moving, slowly, like it was pacing me, watching. The cat's eyes were locked on the brush. It didn't move, just stared, ears forward, tail low. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I turned and started walking again, faster this time. The cat followed, still quiet. I kept listening behind me. Every now and then I thought I heard another branch snap. Always behind, always distant, but never gone. I was sure of it now, something was following. The trail twisted back toward a small stream, the kind you could step over, but it marked the halfway point. I crossed and paused on the far side. The cat stopped in the middle, stood on a rock, and looked back. I looked too. I didn't see anything, but the feeling was still there. That pressure on your back when you know someone's watching. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement. No sound. But I knew something was back there. We kept going. The light was starting to change. Getting late, with long shadows stretching across the path. I picked up the pace. My mind was racing now, but I kept my body steady. Just walk. Get back to the car. About a mile from the trailhead, the path opens into a clearing. That's where I saw it. I didn't hear it at first. Just saw a shape move low to the ground on two legs, maybe three. Too fast to make out clearly. My heart jumped. The cat hissed, actually hissed, and bolted in front of me. Planted itself there, low and tense, tail straight, facing the same direction I'd seen the shape. I stood there, barely breathing. Whatever it was, it hadn't moved again. I didn't want to stay long enough to find out more. I started walking again, this time with the cat in front of me. It moved like it had a job to do, like it was guarding the way forward. Kept looking back, checking the trees. I thought about running, but I didn't want to make noise. I just walked fast, heart thumping, every sense turned up to full. I could feel the sweat running down my back even though the air was cool now. The sky had started turning orange. The last stretch to the parking lot is a straight path with no turns. I could see my car from a distance. I wanted to run, but I didn't. The cat stayed ahead, never turning, never stopping, just walking. When I reached the edge of the trees, I turned around one last time. I didn't see anything, but the cat had stopped beside me. It sat down and stared into the woods. I waited a minute, still nothing. I walked to my car and opened the door. The cat didn't follow. It stayed there, sitting still facing the trees, watching. I sat in the driver's seat, door still open, just watching it. After maybe a minute, it turned and looked at me. Then it walked back toward the trail, quiet, like it had finished what it came to do. I closed the door and started the car. My hands were shaking. I pulled out slowly, not looking back. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time, partly because I wasn't sure what to say. Nothing happened, technically. I wasn't attacked. I didn't see a person, but something had followed me. I knew it, and that stray cat had known too. It had stayed close, kept looking into the trees, moved ahead when it needed to, and stopped when danger felt close. I've thought about it a lot since then. Maybe someone was out there, someone waiting for hikers to be alone and too far from help. Maybe they were watching, keeping just out of sight. Maybe the cat sensed it. Animals know things we don't. Maybe it had seen something like that before. Maybe it had seen something happen out there. I don't know where it came from or why it picked me to guard, but it stayed with me the whole way, until I was safe. I haven't been back to that trail. I still hike, but I stay closer to town now. I keep a better knife on me. I always check for other cars at the trailhead. I move quiet and I listen more, but most of all I watch the animals, because sometimes they know when something isn't right, and sometimes they're the only thing standing between you and whatever's hiding in the trees. I've always been someone who trusts nature. The forest, the mountains, the rivers, they're honest. No surprises, no tricks. What you see is what you get. I'd been hiking for years, always prepared, always cautious. But that day changed something in me. It taught me just how thin the line is between calm and chaos in the wild, and how sometimes the most terrifying things are not what you imagine. The day started like any other. I planned a solo hike in a remote part of a national forest, far from the main trails. I wanted solitude to push myself further. The route was tough. A narrow trail weaving through dense woods, climbing steep hills, and eventually leading to a hidden cavern I had heard about from a local guidebook. The book mentioned an old chamber deep in the forest, carved naturally into the rock, almost a cave. No one ventured there much because it was tricky to find and harder to get out from. That alone made me want to go. I packed light but carefully: water, snacks, a map, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and my trusted multi-tool. I wore sturdy boots and layered clothing. The weather forecast said clear skies and cool temperatures. The morning air was fresh, with a faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sun filtered through the branches, making the forest floor a patchwork of light and shadow. I felt good, excited even. The trail was rough but manageable. Fallen leaves cushioned my steps, and small birds flitted overhead. I crossed a creek on slippery rocks, careful not to slip. The sound of flowing water mixed with the rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. After a few hours, the forest grew thicker. The trees crowded closer, their branches tangling overhead. The sunlight faded as the canopy thickened. The trail became less clear, more rocky. I checked my map often, following the route carefully, counting steps between markers and checking my compass heading. Then I reached it, the entrance to the chamber. It was a narrow opening carved naturally into a rock face, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp stone and something faintly metallic. I switched on my flashlight and crawled inside. The chamber was larger than I expected. It stretched back about 30 feet and then opened into a wider space with jagged walls and a low ceiling. The ground was uneven, covered with loose rocks and dirt. I could hear the distant drip of water echoing through the dark. It was silent except for that, the dripping and my own breathing. I moved slowly, shining my light over the walls. There were strange marks scratched into the stone, lines and grooves that looked like they could be old animal claw marks or maybe human graffiti, weathered by time. My heart beat a little faster. I was alone, deep underground, in a place few people had ever been. Then I noticed something on the floor, broken bones. Small animal bones scattered around, some bleached white by time, others fresh-looking with bits of dried blood. My stomach tightened. This was no ordinary cave. As I explored, I realized the chamber wasn't just one room. There were tunnels leading deeper, narrow and twisting. I debated whether to go further but decided against it. I didn't want to get lost in a maze of rock. I took a few pictures for proof, then began to crawl back toward the entrance. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural noise echoing from the depths. It wasn't quite a growl, but something in between a hiss and a snarl. My skin prickled with cold sweat. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the scrape of something heavy moving over stone. I froze. My mind raced. The guidebook had mentioned legends of wild animals living in the caves, but nothing about anything dangerous like this. The air suddenly felt thicker, harder to breathe. I switched off my flashlight, hoping to stay silent. The noise stopped. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging over rock, moving toward me. My heart pounded in my chest so loud I thought it might give me away. I forced myself to stay still, breathing shallow and quiet. The scraping grew louder, right near the entrance where I was lying. My flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering onto the stone floor. Panic surged, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, something cold brushed against my leg. I jerked back, banging my head on a rock. Pain exploded behind my eye, but adrenaline pushed it aside. I scrambled upright, fumbling for my flashlight on the floor. I switched it on. The beam caught a massive shape, an animal huge and low to the ground, with slick dark fur and glowing eyes reflecting the light. It was a big cat, I thought, a mountain lion or a cougar, but something was wrong. The creature was bigger than any cougar I had seen in books or documentaries. Its shoulders were massive, muscles bulging under thick fur. Its jaws snapped open, revealing long, sharp teeth. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, as it lunged. I raised my flashlight like a shield and yelped, the light dazzling it for a moment. The animal hissed and backed off, then circled slowly. I could see fresh scars on its face, and its eyes were wild, like it had been starving for days. I knew I had to get out fast. My mind raced as I scrambled toward the chamber's entrance. The animal blocked the way, growling low and slow. It moved with frightening speed and silent grace. Every instinct screamed to run, but the space was too tight, the ceiling low. Then the animal did something strange. It paused, cocked its head, and stepped back. I took the chance and bolted out of the chamber, barely noticing the pain in my leg where it had grazed me. Outside, the forest was darkening as the sun dipped behind the trees. I limped down the trail, favoring my injured leg, the creature's growls still ringing in my ears. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of my car's headlights in the distance. I never told anyone exactly what happened in that chamber. Sounds crazy, too wild to believe, but the scars on my leg tell the truth. The creature I saw wasn't a ghost or a myth. It was real, a predator driven underground and desperate. I went back to the ranger station the next day, reported what I saw, but they said the area had no known dangerous animals besides bears and wolves. No cougars had been spotted in years. The chamber was marked off limits after that, but I knew better. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes watching me from the dark. The forest holds secrets, old and sharp, and some things are better left undisturbed. I set out early that morning, just as the sun began to stretch its first warm light across the tall pines lining the trailhead. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled faintly of damp earth and pine needles. I had planned this hike weeks ago, a solo trip to clear my head and get away from the noise of the city. The trail was supposed to be moderate, about 12 miles round trip, winding through dense forest, crossing a few shallow creeks. and ending at a small, quiet lake. I packed my usual gear: sturdy boots, plenty of water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a flashlight just in case. My phone had a weak signal near the trailhead, but I didn't expect to need it. First, everything was perfect. The trail was soft beneath my feet, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. The sun filtered through the trees, creating patches of golden light on the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves. I felt free, peaceful, alive. I was alone but never lonely. The first few miles passed quickly. I paused often to take pictures of the wildflowers and to drink water. The trail climbed gradually, and I could see the distant mountains peeking through the trees. I reached the creek crossing, a narrow wooden bridge spanning clear, cold water tumbling over smooth stones. The sound of the water was soothing. I stopped for a snack, sitting on a moss-covered rock beside the stream. That's when things started to feel off. I noticed the forest around me had suddenly gone very quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals. The only sound was the creek and my own breathing. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I looked around, expecting to see a deer or squirrel, but the forest was strangely empty. I shrugged it off and continued. The trail narrowed and became steeper. I had to use my hands to scramble over roots and rocks. My legs burned, but the thought of the lake kept me going. About 4 miles in, I came to a fork. The map was old, the ink faded, and the paths weren't clearly marked. I hesitated. One path looked wider, well-worn, the other narrower and covered with branches. I chose the wider path. First, it seemed right. The trail was clear and easy to follow. But after about 30 minutes, the landscape changed. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches twisting overhead like giant fingers blocking out the sun. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a thick fog began to rise from the ground, swirling around my boots. I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers for hours. No footprints, no litter, no signs of recent visitors. Just me and the growing silence. The fog thickened, and the trail became harder to see. I slowed down, gripping my flashlight and map tighter. My heart started to beat faster. Then, I heard it. A faint, snapping noise, like a twig breaking underfoot. I stopped and listened. Nothing. I kept walking, but the sound came again, a little closer this time. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight into the fog. Nothing but mist and trees. Panic crept in. I checked the map again, trying to orient myself, but the fog made everything look the same. I decided to turn back. Maybe I had taken the wrong path. I retraced my steps, but the fog was thicker now, the trail barely visible. The snapping sound followed me, sometimes behind, sometimes to the side, never steady, always distant enough to make me doubt what I was hearing. I quickened my pace, but my boots slipped on wet leaves and mud. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree trunk, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light in the distance. Relief flooded me. I headed toward it, hoping it was the main trail or maybe another hiker's campfire. As I drew closer, the light flickered like a small flame. I moved cautiously, flashlight sweeping over the ground and trees. Then I saw it, a small, abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, surrounded by scattered cans and an old, torn tent. No one was there, but the place looked recently used. I felt a strange chill, more from the eerie silence than the cold air. I sat down on a log, trying to calm my shaking hands. The snapping noises had stopped, but I felt eyes on me, like something was watching from the shadows. I didn't want to stay here, but the fog was too thick to continue wandering. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was low. I had to find the main trail before nightfall. I rested for a few minutes, drinking water and eating a granola bar, then stood up and prepared to leave. That's when I heard it again. Not a snap, but a low growl, deep and guttural. It wasn't an animal I recognized. My stomach dropped. I shined my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught something moving, just at the edge of the light, a large shape slipping behind a tree. I didn't wait to find out more. I started running, stumbling down the hill through the fog, branches scraping my arms and face. The growling grew louder, mixed with heavy footsteps crashing through the brush behind me. I didn't look back. I just ran. The trail seemed endless. Every step was agony, but fear pushed me forward. I screamed inside, though no sound came out. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own feet. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, crashing through underbrush and hitting rocks. Pain exploded in my side, but I scrambled up, heart pounding. When I finally broke through the trees, I found the main trail again, clear and wide. The fog began to lift with the setting sun. The growls faded, and the forest returned to its natural sounds. Birds singing, leaves rustling. I ran the last mile out of the woods and onto the road where a car passed by. I waved frantically until it stopped. The driver called 911 as I collapsed in the passenger seat, breathless and covered in scratches. The search later found no evidence of what had followed me. No tracks, no animals large enough to growl like that. I never went back to that trail. I've always loved camping, especially near the ocean. The sound of waves, the salty breeze, the smell of the sea mingled with the smell of wood smoke. It all feels like freedom to me. So when a friend told me about this stretch of beach in Hawaii where people sometimes camped, despite the signs that said it wasn't allowed, I was intrigued. She was the kind of person who didn't always follow the rules, and she said the place was magical at night, perfect for watching the stars and falling asleep to the surf. She decided to camp there alone one weekend. I wasn't with her, but when she told me about what happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What she went through made me respect those signs more than ever. It was a scary experience, one that showed me just how wild and unpredictable nature can be, especially when you push its boundaries. She arrived at the beach just before sunset. The sky was painted in deep oranges and reds, the sun dipping slowly behind the mountains. The air was warm but not hot, with a steady ocean breeze keeping things comfortable. The beach itself was wide, covered in soft white sand that felt cool under bare feet. Palm trees lined the edge of the sand, their fronds rustling softly in the wind. Despite the warning signs clearly posted near the parking area, no camping on the beach, she set up her small tent and sleeping bag on a flat stretch of sand, close enough to the water to hear the waves but far enough not to be drenched by the tide. She told me later that the spot seemed perfect, private, peaceful, and untouched. She spent the evening watching the sunset, taking pictures, and writing in her journal by the light of a small camp lantern. The beach was quiet except for the occasional call of seabirds and the rhythmic crash of the surf. She felt relaxed, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the place. As night fell, the temperature dropped just a bit, and the stars came out, bright and clear in the dark Hawaiian sky. She climbed into her sleeping bag inside the tent, tired from the day's travel but happy to be there. She drifted off quickly, the sound of the ocean lulling her to sleep. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, she woke up. At first, she wasn't sure why. The silence inside the tent had changed. There was a strange rustling noise, faint but persistent, like something moving lightly over fabric. Her skin prickled with unease. She opened her eyes slowly and reached out to adjust the sleeping bag. That's when she felt it. A crawling sensation against her legs and arms, something moving beneath the fabric. Panicking slightly, she pulled back the sleeping bag to see what was inside. To her horror, it was filled with giant cockroaches. They were everywhere, writhing and crawling, their long antennae twitching as they moved in the dim light of the lantern. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The insects were at least 2 inches long, with shiny brown shells that caught the faint light, making them look even more menacing. Their legs scrambled against the fabric as they tried to find an escape route. She had heard stories about cockroaches in tropical climates, but seeing so many at once, inside her sleeping bag, was terrifying. She scrambled out of the sleeping bag as fast as she could, brushing off the bugs that had crawled onto her skin. The cold night air hit her bare arms, making her shiver. She checked her clothes and skin carefully, trying to shake off any remaining insects. She looked around the tent. The floor was covered in sand, and she spotted a few cockroaches scurrying in the corners, trying to hide under her gear. It was clear that the entire area was infested. She felt a wave of nausea and disgust, but also fear. The idea that so many cockroaches had crawled into her sleeping bag while she slept was unsettling. She realized she had ignored the signs for a reason. The cockroaches weren't just a nuisance. They carried bacteria and could bite, especially if disturbed. She knew from experience that tropical cockroach bites could cause painful reactions, infections, and allergic responses. She had no choice but to pack up immediately. The beach was dark and empty, the only sound the crashing waves. Her hands trembled as she rolled up the sleeping bag, trying not to let the insects escape. She shook it out repeatedly, watching as cockroaches fell into the sand. Once she had everything packed, she started walking toward her car, which was parked several hundred meters away near the road. The path back was rougher than she remembered in the dark. Sand shifted underfoot, and twisted roots from the palm trees snagged her boots. The night air was heavy with the smell of seaweed and decaying plant matter. Occasionally, she stopped and shone her flashlight on the ground, wary of any more cockroaches or other insects. The walk felt endless. The loneliness of the night and the thought of what had happened made her heart race. When she finally reached her car, she locked the doors quickly and sat inside, trying to calm her breath. She couldn't stop thinking about the cockroaches, how they had invaded her personal space, how they had crawled over her while she slept. Over the next few days, she cleaned her gear thoroughly, using strong insecticides and washing everything multiple times. She checked her skin for bites but was lucky to avoid any serious reactions. Still, she felt shaken. That night on the beach had changed her perspective on camping in tropical areas. She realized the importance of respecting the environment, including the signs and warnings meant to keep people safe. The beach wasn't just a pretty place. It was home to many creatures, some harmless, some dangerous, and some that could surprise you in the worst ways. Since then, she never camps where it's prohibited, no matter how tempting the spot looks. She learned that nature can be beautiful but also unforgiving, especially when you ignore the rules. The cockroaches weren't monsters or ghosts. They were just part of the natural ecosystem, doing what they do. But that night, their presence became a vivid reminder that in the wild, you have to be careful and prepared, or you might end up facing something you're not ready for. For me, hearing her story was a wake-up call. I still love camping, but now I always check the rules and respect the warnings. And I never underestimate the smallest creatures. They might be quiet, but they can make the night a lot scarier than you expect.